Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you are joining for the first time, this is part of our podcast series for which we meet every Thursday, Friday from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern, wherever we can find the time with the guest, because sometimes there could be time zone issue. In this series, we bring some very exciting guests from the industry. So in a second, we are going to introduce our guest, but just a few points from the logistics perspective that we interviewed several exciting guests in the past as well. So make sure you guys check on YouTube, and then we are bringing some more, in the following week. Brian Jackson, I guess, is coming on next week. He's from Infotech Research. So these are going to be very exciting interviews. On that note, if you're in the audience, we are always looking for a lot of questions. If you have any sort of questions, comments, stories that you are able to relate with that, those are the ones that we are going to be using a lot as part of the interview. So make sure you guys comment. On that note, Matt, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And Sam, thank you so much for having me. And I hope your listeners have a great time. I strongly encourage them to ask questions as well. So I'm Matt Van Italy, the founder and CEO of a software company called SEMA. And what we do is bridge the gap between technologists and non-technologists to understand what's going on in the code and what's going on with engineering. Now, your audience, I know, is very familiar with CRM tools and ERP tools that bring executive insight into sales, into business processes, right? They're tools that frontline employees use, ERPs. They're tools that managers use, but they're also tools that the executive team uses to keep the C-suite informed and keep the board of directors informed, right? There are report outs from ERPs to the CEO, to the board of directors, to stakeholders, to investors, etc. In the world of software engineering, there are a myriad, tens of thousands of excellent software development tools for engineers, so for frontline individual contributors. There are also thousands of great tools for engineering managers. But when it comes to executive insight into software, how does a CTO, for example, report out on the state of engineering to the board of directors, the CEO, to investors, etc.? She or he will typically have to rely on homegrown combinations of tools, on various spreadsheets, on a gut sense, which very well may be true, but it's a lot less quantitative and contextualized than what the boards of directors and the C-suite is used to getting in other areas. So SEMA was born to translate between the tech world, that detail, and to provide that detail, and for non-technical audiences to understand it as well.
Okay, so very interesting, and thanks once again, for joining in. It's always very interesting to hear different perspectives from different community. And Matt, as you know, our audience is slightly different. I mean, it's going to be the business audience, and you mentioned that you have myriad of tools in the engineering department. But for the most part, our community, the way they like to think and work is they always like to think that okay, there is only one tool, which is called ERP. There should not be a need for the second tool. And there is only one guy called IT guy. So that's how they like to think, right? Obviously, it gets very complex underneath, and that's what we are going to discuss a little bit more. In understanding number one, what are those assembly structures, that are enabling this whole process and creating these giant tools. And underneath, they could have a lot. It's just that most customers, at least in our case, they don't have visibility into how these tools are created. So before we dig into that, and we are going to peel a lot of layers there, but we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest that come on the show, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth. And this is more from the business perspective, business growth.
Great. Ask the question slightly differently. What do I believe about business flows? What
Growth, like growing growth. Yeah. So, what's your perspective? What's your take on business growth? Because the theme of the podcast is business growth, so we are looking to see, how do you believe in growth, and what is the business growth for you? It's open-ended
Sure.
question.
Well, I might answer it a little bit theoretically first,
Yeah.
because that is how I think about growth, and that is I want to introduce the idea of a logic model.
Okay.
And for those of you, this comes from the social sciences, and I have found it's an incredibly good way to understand how organizations in general do work and should work, and how businesses do work and should work with respect to growth. So the idea of a logic model, and this is the standard definition with a little bit of tweaks from me, is that there are resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And of course, the definition of a resource is it could be personnel, it could be plants, it could be funding, stuff that can do stuff. Activities is the doing of stuff, of course. And then let's talk about outputs versus outcomes. Outputs are the results of activities that can be as long of a list as you want. Organizations, probably have tens of thousands of outputs.
Yeah.
Outcomes are the results of activities that are the most important. And any organization can only have 3 to 7 at most outcomes. And the art and the science of making organizations work, in my experience, is being incredibly clear about what is an outcome and what is an output. And I started that way because growth and profitability are the two core outcomes. Depending on an organization, risk management or avoiding major risks is probably the third. And it's easy. It's easy for teams, for organizations to go to work and say, I'm carrying out activities. Those activities are doing something. So something's happening, and therefore things are going well. And it really takes courage to step back and say, well, we're doing something, but does it actually drive the key results, the outcomes? Is it actually contributing to growth? There's a famous quote from the management theorist Peter Drucker: there's nothing more inefficient as that which should not have been done in the first place. It doesn't matter how much you optimize a process, that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If it's not actually, if it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. And so when I think about what is growth and how do we get there, whether it's our organization or another, I really start first with what does that logic model look like? What is it that will actually lead to growth outcomes, or most likely to lead to growth outcomes? And are we achieving them? And if we're not achieving them, what is it about the resources and activity and the intermediate outputs that might stop us from getting there?
Okay, so very interesting. So I'm going to tee up the conversation, related to the logic models, I guess, right? The one you mentioned. Now, in our community, people might not be familiar with what is a software bill of material. But in your case, obviously, you know that. And now, after the incident of CrowdStrike, now people understand these dependencies just a little bit, okay? And they at least have the understanding that in the world of cloud, there are a lot of dependencies that can be automated, but then there are also going to be implications because of that. If one link fails, then everything else is going to fail, and that's where I guess the risk management is going to be valid. Before, I don't know, this event, if you spoke about software supply chain or software bombs, I don't know how many people really cared for it, to be completely honest. Okay, they are always going to think that, okay, these engineers, developers, they can figure these things out. Why should I care? I should care about the real supply chain, right? But the software supply chain matters as well, especially from the risk management perspective. So describe a little bit in terms of why people should care for software supply chain, and number two, how complex does it get? Let's say if you pick any of the categories of the software, CRM, ERP, how many layers are we talking about, and how much can it break?
Absolutely. Well, you did a great job of introducing the idea of software bills of materials just in that introduction. I like to think of it as an ingredients list.
Yeah,
Just like you can look at the back of a cereal box or what
yeah,
have you and see how much are carbohydrates or proteins or fat, right? The same idea for a software bill of materials
yeah,
is to understand the primary components. So the traditional software bill of materials really focuses on two parts. One is the code
yeah,
that the team themselves wrote. The other part is the code that the team is borrowing or using that comes from open source. So of course, everyone on this podcast has heard about open source, but let me just give you the 101 on it, the basics. Open source is code that is, in theory, and we'll come
yeah,
back to that, freely accessible to use in a code base. You can go to a public source. GitHub is the world's largest source for open source, and freely use on paper, freely use that code in part of your own software. And it can be magically helpful. There are so many problems, engineering problems, software problems, that have already been solved with an existing open source library or component
yeah,
that it really doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel,
yeah,
to start from scratch when there is a great open source component. So your audience thinks about build versus buy all the time. Great software engineers, when they're deciding how to solve a business problem with the
yeah,
code, one of the first questions is, should I build it or should I buy it? And that buying could be either a commercial piece of software or open source.
yeah,
And again, in theory, it could be free, although we'll come back to some of the implications of that, but it's still part of not doing it yourself. And a great craftsperson engineer knows, if you want to code on the weekends and come up with build something that has been built already, fine. But at work, let's get to the best answer as fast as possible, and open source is the way to do that. As a result of
yeah,
how helpful open source is, and it's been in aggressive use in commercial settings for 25 to
yeah,
30 years, but it's been around for 70 years, actually, since the beginning of software, but
yeah,
really aggressive now. At least 97% of code has a massive amount of open source
yeah,
in it. Because, if you think about software needs a clock.
yeah,
Most things you need a time, you need, keep track of time one way or the other. Well, guess what? The open source community has come up with so many different versions of clocks that you should almost certainly not be building your own, because you're not going to add any specialized value in figuring out timekeeping relative to all the different ways it's already been there. And so, as a general rule, almost all clock
yeah,
functionality in a piece of software comes from open source. And it's sort of like, what's the best analogy here? Um, it is not uncommon, maybe I'll say it like this, it is not uncommon for 100 times more of the company or the organization's code
yeah,
to actually be open source instead.
yeah,
Because if you're, um, let's say you're building timekeeping software
yeah,
and or timekeeping for employees, you might write a certain number of lines of code. You might pull in or reference the clock, and that clock has a lot of code. And then you might pull in the basic web interface, because that
yeah,
also has been solved with open source. And so your own code might be 1% of the total amount of code that's there. And so if, as we all know, code can be insecure,
Yeah.
Code can be have quality issues. Code can have intellectual property issues.
Yeah.
All those things are true. If 100 times more of your code is written by open source than your own code, well, it sure as heck makes it really important to keep track, to have that software bill of materials to keep track, right? If you if you back to the calories example or the food
Yeah.
example, if you had if you ate a grape,
Yeah.
and then 20 boxes of cereal a day, it doesn't really matter. Like, I'm sure you need to know what's in the grape, but 20 boxes of cereal, you need to know what's in those 20 boxes of cereal because that's where the vast majority of your calories are. I hope that
Yeah.
analogy works, right? Open source code is such a gigantic proportion of a company's code base that you really need to keep track, and that's the beauty of a software bill of materials.
Yeah, so very interesting. So I'm definitely going to peel some more layers there because we need to understand this a little bit better, right? Even for supply chain, and I keep going back to supply chain because the issues that we are noticing in the last 4 or 5 years, we never thought that supply chain could be so much dependent. We might have so many issues in the world just because of supply chain. In fact, if I were to attribute the economy issues in the last 4 or 5 years, they were primarily because of supply chain, right? In my mind, I think the software supply chain is the same. It's just that we just don't know enough, and we just don't care enough right now, to be completely honest. Okay, so do you see that in the software world there are going to be some sort of regulatory changes later on? One of the points that you had mentioned is this whole idea of ingredient list, and we know that when we are eating something, we look for the ingredients in terms of what we are eating, but that is something that is not available on software. Okay, if you are getting a manufactured goods, you want to know where the manufactured goods is coming from. I'll tell you a
Mhm.
story. I mean, see, this weekend, I don't know whether you followed the news or not, but the whole attack on this one, the Middle East attack right now, in that the embedded system was rigged, right? Now this could very well happen from the software perspective as well, which is a humongous risk. In this particular case, they could not even trace which company did it, which is just horrible. Number one, it was rigged, and number two, they have very little traceability in terms of the commercial agreement, commercial structure, commercial accountability. Now the software world is even different, right? Because when you're acquiring these let's say free open source library, sometimes even you don't even know who's committing, who's touching that code, what could be the risks that could be embedded there. So what are your thoughts around that, overall in terms of the risk management? So let's say if I'm a CFO, I am buying this commercial software with the hope and faith that I'm not going to have any sort of risks. But then I'm actually getting into at least a million risks because we don't even know what we are buying here, right?
Yeah. Well, you say it really interestingly. If I'm a CEO, I want to buy software that I hope doesn't come with risk.
Yeah.
I would say, CFOs who are listening, it's definitely coming with risk.
Yep.
There is absolutely no way around it. Um, you think about just a little bit of background. Code has functional requirements
Yeah.
and non-functional requirements. Functional requirements are what does the product do and how well does it do it? I want timekeeping. I want it to be accurate, and I want the page to load quickly.
Yeah.
And I want it to work on mobile. Those are functional requirements. Non-functional requirements are things under the hood. I want it to be secure. I want it to be um, secure. I want it to be intellectual protection. I want there to be intellectual property protection.
Yeah.
I want it to be reliable. Those are non-functional requirements. So I'm here to say, and I didn't say this before, we've analyzed $1.6 trillion worth of code. $1.6 trillion worth of code for every type of software team, from a single person organization to public companies that are being taken private. I'm here to say, Mr. and Mrs. and Miss CFO, all code comes with risk. And I like to think of it sort of like taking on debt. You will definitely have debt. Just like for organizations, businesses, it's almost always a good idea to have debt. So too, code comes with debt, quality debt, security debt, intellectual property debt. It's there. So it's not a question of do you have it or don't you? It's a question of are you managing it? Are you aware of it? Are you caught? Are you caught off guard? Now, some people hearing that say, "Oh my goodness! Well, if software I'm buying comes with risk, I better make my own. I better not purchase um, commercial off-the-shelf software or COTS. I should build it myself." Well, that leads to my other lecture, Mr. and Mrs. And Miss CFO. When in doubt, do not build your own software. Do not do it, because it is incredibly hard to manage the risks.
Yep.
It's incredibly hard to get the functionality, to build the functionality right, and it's incredibly hard to manage the non-functional requirements.
Yep.
So that may sound like a tension. All software comes with risk, but don't build it yourself. Go find somebody who's already built and is good at building software. But both of those things are true. And the way that we reconcile those is the commercial off-the-shelf software that you're licensing. If you do a good job of risk management, that is way safer for you than you building it yourself. Because if you build it yourself, you're going to have to figure out how to manage all those risks. And long story short, one of the absolute best ways to manage the risk of software you are acquiring, or you're licensing, etc., is through a software bill of materials. It is understanding that ingredients list, and in the case of open source, knowing how much of it is, what kinds of open source it is, the security risks associated, because open source has security risks, with the intellectual property risk, the maintainability of it, and that the combination of professional organizations building code plus the software bill of materials is absolutely the best answer in almost all cases for organizations, rather than trying to build the software themselves and solve the problem.
Yeah, so this brings up to a very, very, very interesting point, and sometimes it's hard for me to be able to track the private equity structure. I know that, Matt. I think you worked with Vista Equity, and I don't know if they still sort of invested in your current company. Is it part of the Vista Equity or some other private equity right now?
So it's definitely true that I've had the great pleasure of serving as an operating executive for software companies owned by a terrific software investor, Vista Equity Partners. But what I'm speaking here today is on CIMA's own behalf, and in no way speaks to Vista's perspective. We're here speaking here as Vista.
Yeah,
speaking here as CIMA. Excuse me. Speaking here as CIMA. Most certainly not speaking as Vista.
Great clarification. And the point that I'm trying to bring is, there are some correlations here, and that we need to understand, overall, from the accountability perspective, right? So Klarna executive made one of the comments, and I don't know whether you track that or not. This whole AI, generative AI, now this is obviously very huge right now. People are trying to figure out, how they can take advantage of that. Generative AI can write software, it can write code. So now they are trying to figure out, okay, can we write CRM? Can we write ERP? And this was a big news story that we were discussing on LinkedIn as well. And I don't know if you're connected with John Reed from Diginomica. He writes amazing pieces. I'm a big fan of his work. Okay, so we were sort of having this back and forth in terms of what is going on with Klarna at this point of time. And I think there was a big discussion in the Workday Rising as well. In that community, they had their annual conference, right? So this guy is claiming that, and they have created their own CRM software, I guess, and Workday. So they are saying that, I don't need Salesforce anymore. So this is going back to your comment that, okay, you are recommending that, do not ever write your software. Now, AI is letting you write the software, but you did mention that there are two things. One is going to be your functional requirement. One is going to be your non-functional requirement. And I don't know, I think there is some correlation between, and Klarna is a very big company. I think I don't know if they are invested by Vista or not, but the comment seems very responsible in my mind. I mean, as the software person, and I don't know how you would respond to that. So I'm definitely looking to hear from you. Let's say if a company, companies like Klarna, because at this point of time, if you look at the company, they are probably paying roughly about $200 million in licensing for the CRM software, for HCM software. So there is a play here that, okay, you need to pay so much for the commercial software, but as the software guy, I would never recommend any company to write their own software, because it's very, 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 very hard. You have no idea how soon you might exhaust that $200 million if you were to create your own software. So that's my personal position. Now, you tell me how you would respond to this comment.
So Sam, you are a deep ERP expert. Under what circumstances would you recommend that a company build their own ERP versus licensing somebody else's?
So if you are talking about ERP, real ERP, never ever. Okay, just don't do it. Just don't do it. It's not worth it. Companies have spent billions and millions of dollars. You have no idea how scalable, how complex ERP gets. Just don't build it. Even if you are successful, even if you are able to claim that you are able to build ERP, it's not gonna go anywhere. Okay.
Yes. So ladies and gentlemen, Sam's answer on ERPs is my answer on CRMs and is my answer on almost any meaningful to large application. So even if you are great at making software, and I have no doubt that Klarna is great at making software, it's only one kind of software. And every piece of software comes with different sets of knowledge requirements, maintainability requirements, etc. And it is exceptionally unlikely that you are going to be able to maintain the continued effort, put in the continued investment in, well, first building it in a way that meets your requirements, but then maintaining it
Yeah.
afterwards. Coders, sometimes folks think about, code as a novel.
Yeah.
I like to think of code as a half-written novel.
Yep.
It will never be done.
Yep.
It will never be done.
Yep.
There will be new requirements. There will be new requirements. There will be new risks. Things will get out of date. It will never finish.
Yeah.
And so it is not a point in time. It is a journey. Now, Sam, you said something which, of course, is very near and dear to my heart, which is the rise of generative AI in coding.
Yeah.
So, of course, as everyone knows, the rises of AI have led to this incredible generative AI phenomenon.
Yeah.
And if you take, let's just take human writing,
Yeah.
and please, if you're listening to this and you have not started experimenting with generative AI, please do. Even if you're doing it at home, just to get to know it, it is fundamentally a part of every knowledge worker's workflow at every level, forever. So please be using it. If for some reason your company doesn't let you do it, which I hope is not the case, at least be using it at home.
Yeah.
So, of course, if you're at least a little bit familiar with it, whether it's human writing or song or art, generative AI can really help you create or experiment or draft as you see fit, much faster, but not fully accurately. Same is absolutely true for code. Generative AI can help draft code, make suggestions, give feedback, and as a result, we are at the very beginning of a productivity revolution for generative AI in the software development lifecycle.
Yeah.
Some organizations have already been able to realize some of those productivity gains. Some have not, but there is no question it is coming. There is no question that productivity revolution is coming. So you could imagine that folks like Klarna could, as a result of this productivity gains, could therefore, and of course, it seems like the argument they made, seems like, well, we can do it ourselves, we can do it much faster in Gen AI, etc. That is not SEMA's perspective. We like to take the long view, and we're just talking about generative AI, and that's a form of an ingredients list. Some of the code now is literally written by humans on your team.
Yeah.
Some of it's written by other humans who are not on your team, and that's open source code.
Yeah.
And then a third set is code written by an LLM. The human may prompt it, but the LLM wrote it. And so now we have 3 parts of an ingredients list. If we think about, let's just take space exploration because it's fun and it's good to, easy to wrap our heads around.
Yeah.
The mission control system for the United States Apollo mission, created in the 50s and 60s, took approximately 1,000 times more developers to build than the SpaceX mission control. and that's a rough ratio of how many engineers were working on Apollo mission control and how many systems they were building. They were building one mission control system, and roughly speaking, SpaceX has one, let me get it right, 1/100th the developers for 10 times the number of systems. So different mission control systems for different parts. And so software development, roughly, SEMA's estimate, is 1,000 times more productive between the early 2000 teens
Yeah.
from the 1960s. I still, even if AI hadn't showed up, even if building software is 1,000 times easier than it was, I still would not build your own CRM. No way, Jose, because it's not just about productivity. It's not just about speed, whatever. It is about all of these other requirements on top of it. It is relying on the expertise.
Yeah.
There's an expression, stick to your knitting. Do
Yeah.
the thing that you really do well.
Yeah.
It is exceptionally unlikely that a system as sophisticated as a CRM
Yeah.
or an ERP, just like you said, even though you're now faster at it, you could be like, think of a car that you just made 5 times faster, but you don't have a good driver. Would you drive it faster? No, of course not. You would rely on a driver, right? The
Yeah.
driver makes the difference. It's that subject matter expertise. I could go to ChatGPT tomorrow and produce hundreds of thousands of lines of code. It might be partially right, but it's going to lack context. It's going to lack the situational knowledge. So long story short, even though Gen AI will in the software development process will represent a massive productivity gain, and even though we're only at the beginning of the productivity gains it's going to deliver,
Yeah.
it doesn't change my answer that we're just now making software development easier and faster. It doesn't not producing subject matter expertise that should lead people to build something their own versus relying on experts.
Yeah, so very interesting comment. So let's take this one step further, I guess. One of the ERP systems, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, is called Odoo. Okay, and the whole notion of Odoo, the way they started, it's all open source. They are big champion of open source. They have my friend Eric Kimberling. I don't know whether you know him or not. He's very popular in the ERP community, and he likes to call this as more of the cult like following for Odoo, and which is true, right? Because you have a lot of developers who are super excited. They just don't like this idea of guarding the software, licensing the software, commercial software, which you are not recommending here. 90% of the software developers, I mean, they would like to see everything to be open, just because they like to see things, they like to play with things, they like to try things, I guess. That could be the reason, but again, for commercial software, probably it does not work. So now, with open source, obviously, when you have IT folks, the technology folks that are driving these organizations, their perspective is going to be that, okay, even if I buy commercial software, in Odoo, there's going to be a degree of commercialness. I don't know if that is even a word, in that. So where would you sort of draw the line in terms of, because even in a commercial software, you mentioned that there's going to be a substantial component that is going to be open source. So let's say if I'm buying SAP, even SAP is consuming substantial amount of open source. Infor is consuming substantial amount of open source. So it's not that, I mean, see, everything is commercial in that. So can I not build my own, I guess, is my question.
Sure. So let's structure this the right way.
Yeah.
One option is to build the software yourself. A second option is to buy commercial off-the-shelf software, COTS. A third option is to rely on a fully complete open source product. So not just open source as a component,
Yeah.
but open source as the product itself. And Ordo, of course, is one example. There are many great products that are available via open source. That, to me,
Yeah.
is a lot closer to buying than building, because it just so happens that the cost in certain circumstances can be free. or the financial cost can be zero, but it still is software that fully works off the shelf. The most important thing when thinking about commercial um, buying commercial software using open source, a fully complete open source product, or building it yourself, is to be incredibly clear about what your organization does well and does not do well,
Yeah.
and what your expertise is and does not. Almost always, that will then rule out you building the software yourself. It's, in the vast majority of things, you should not be building software for your own use as an organization. That then leads to commercial off-the-shelf software versus open source software.
Yeah.
And for that, the most important thing is to have an extremely skilled strategic engineering leader who is able to translate the business requirements, and I should say, in working in partnership with the business leaders and the procurement leaders, and to really be incredibly clear about what problems need to be solved, but what's the job to be done, and what of the options are the most attractive between the multiple commercial off-the-shelf solutions and the multiple open source solutions. If you choose to go down the open source path, it's incredibly important to not think of it as, oh my God, we just got this for free. Hooray for us, we just saved some money. That is not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that open source software, a fully formed open source software, still comes with a required investment, and you must take that into account when you're making your purchase or your decision or your options evaluation. One is, on the one hand, some of those solutions have a paid tier, and it's very frequently the right answer, even if you're using open source. The baseline level is to get the extra functionality or support or what have you from the paid tier. So definitely consider that. Even if, number two, even if it is fully free, fully financially free, we think organizations have an obligation who are using open source to be good stewards and give back to that community. Which is to say, let their software engineers contribute back. So I would not assume that using open source software, even if it is, quote, financially free, is actually free. You should plan on an investment of dollars. And frankly, even if you're not a software company, and even if it's literally free, I would still make a contribution. I would pay for that software, for the incredibly hardworking open source community members who are maintaining it. It's just the right thing to do, to make sure that software is, to say thank you to the community who's worked so hard on it, and to make sure that software continues to stay available.
Okay, so yeah, very interesting points, and I don't know how many people really think in that direction. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Now I want to take this to one more direction that we want to touch on overall from the accountability perspective, I guess, right? And again, going back to the CrowdStrike incident, which is fairly new, I guess, overall from the learning perspective. What all companies should be thinking about, and one of the things that are coming very soon, and we have had that discussion as well overall, from the political spectrum or from the policy perspective, that for AI the changes are coming, meaning companies need to report, they need to announce, okay, where they are consuming the content from, because there are privacy compliance issues, national security issues, who's taking the data, etc. So there are so many different things that are happening in the AI space. The question to you is, do you foresee similar things happening in the software space as well? Meaning, are we going to see some sort of ingredients printed, in the future that is going to be, okay, you are buying SAP. Okay, what all are you utilizing? What is the dependency of each of those software? Is it open source, not open source? Are companies going to be requesting the whole bill of material later on? And if that happens, obviously that becomes a huge challenge for companies to be able to maintain, because in SaaS now, the way the contracts are structured, they can change their contracts any minute. Even the contracts are very fluid the way they are structured, online contracts, right?
Mhm.
So where is the legal accountability, I guess, overall?
Yeah. Well, the good news is the most sophisticated acquirers of software
Yeah,
and software companies, so
yeah,
investors in software companies, as well as people, as well as organizations who are buying software, they actually have already, in many cases, they understand how important knowing that list of ingredients is. And so if you talk to sophisticated procurement offices
yeah.
um, and absolutely software investors and acquirers, they absolutely understand
Hmm.
that knowing the bill of materials with respect to open source is fundamental. Is fundamental to keeping code safe. So in any medium or large software investment transaction,
Yeah.
you can't, you will not be successful selling a business or getting investment from a business for medium and large size investments without being able to demonstrate your software ingredients list, your software bill of materials for open source. What's really interesting is that in a very short period of time, even though uh, less than a year, frankly, that idea of having an ingredients list about software for open source has now extended to an ingredients list for generative AI code. And so if a software bill of materials is how much open source code is in the code base, or SBOM, a
Yeah.
generative AI bill of materials is, or GBOM is how much generative AI code is in the code base. And in an extremely short period of time, it is now the GBOM, along with an SBOM, is a critical part of the acquisition of software companies.
Hmm.
And what we expect to happen quite soon is for that to expand into procurement as well. And so anytime anybody wants to know the SBOM,
Hmm.
they're also going to want to see the GBOM as well for the safety, for all of the reasons, for safety, for intellectual property protection, for maintainability of the code. We think that is a rapidly changing world with respect to software procurement and risk management.
Interesting. So, for the listeners who might not know about GBOM, SBOM, maybe describe that a little bit. Okay, what is the difference between those two?
Yeah. So an SBOM is the ingredients list of how much of the code is written by your team and how much of the code is written by open source,
Hmm.
what kind of open source is used, and where is it. A GBOM is how much of the code is written by your team and how much of the code is written by generative AI tools, such as general
Okay.
Gen AI tools like ChatGPT, or coding specific Gen AI tools like Copilot.
Hmm.
Doesn't matter which of those tools it is, but the GBOM keeps track of how much of the code comes from each category, and it literally is an ingredients list. SBOM is about open source, and the GBOM is about generative AI code.
Okay, very interesting. So, do you have any examples or a story that you might be able to share? How you have helped companies. I don't know if these were more of the investment companies who were acquiring the software and they wanted to know, or are these more of the end customers? So, pick a example or a couple of examples and describe, what is the pain point they had and how you help them from with your software.
Absolutely. And um, we are very honored, and incredible kudos to the amazing engineers and product leaders on SEMA's team. But we are honored to be the inventors of the generative AI bill of materials.
Hmm.
And you know, good ideas have 1,000 fathers, and this is the expression. SEMA had already been one of many providers uh, of SBOMs. So we've been building SBOMs for the last 7 years, and some of our clients asked us to expand our capabilities into making a GBOM. In the first use case was for technical due diligence, mergers and acquisitions, the purchase or investment in software um, of companies with software assets. Um, and so SEMA has, the first use case for GBOMs was understanding, well, if we're buying this company, how much of it was written by a human and how much of it was written by a computer? And absolutely honored that in a really quite short period of time, we went from idea in the market to frankly, universal adoption among CMS clients, and we're
Yeah.
honored to serve many of the world's best software investors and acquirers. So pretty much overnight, GBOMs are now part of technical due diligence for the most sophisticated investors. And the reason is using generative AI code could mean the code is less secure, could be less intellectual property protection, could be there could be less intellectual property protection. It could be less maintainable.
Yeah.
But also, because generative AI is such a powerful productivity tool, if you don't use Gen AI enough, you're leaving value on the table.
Yeah.
So back to that open source example, imagine if you were writing code without open source. Oh my goodness, you would be falling behind your
Yeah.
competitors because you're reinventing clocks and other
Yeah.
things that don't need to exist. And so the idea of the generative AI bill of materials, or GBOM, is to sort of like not too much, not too little, but just right. Not too little, make sure that you're getting enough productivity gains, not too much of the wrong kind of use. You really want to use it safely, but to just get it just right. So that was the first use case for a generative AI bill of materials, and more generally, the space of generative AI code transparency. The next use case is that companies are using it every day, using it continuously to measure and increase the ROI from using these Gen AI tools. So almost every engineer has access to one of those tools. If you don't, leaders, please make sure your engineers have access to at least one very high quality Gen AI coding tool, preferably more than one, because different ones work differently. The ROI is huge if the teams get to use it the right way. And so once you have those tools, our clients are now using a continuous creation of a GBOM or Gen AI detection to help make sure that teams are using it enough to really get to use it safely and to get that right level of productivity gain from it.
Okay, so very interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned in your comment, and this is just a clarification that you might want to provide, is that the Gen AI code is not going to be as maintainable, but it also depends upon who is creating those prompts, because sometimes the prompts could differ and then quality may differ based on that. So even if I know that, okay, how much is the percentage generated by generative AI versus human, we can't simply say that, you know what, generative AI is always going to be bad and human is always going to be good. It could be either ways, I guess, right? Depending upon the skills of the
Exactly right.
either
So
it's
let's
right. Yeah, go.
Exactly. So let's use a simple example, and then we'll see how it applies to Gen AI. So
Yeah,
Sam, imagine you were a professor, a university
yeah,
professor, and a student turned in an essay, and you asked that student, "How did you create this paper?" And the student said, "I I put in some prompts into an LLM and spit out an answer."
yeah,
And then you said, "Did you modify it after the LLM did it?" And the student said, "No, this is 100%
yeah.
coming from the LLM." What questions would you have, Sam, about that paper? What would be some of your fears and concerns about that essay?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly speaking, from my perspective, I think it's going to be fairly boilerplate. The kind of quality that I have personally seen, unless it is going to be some sort of original writing that you wrote and then you ask the generative AI to simply rephrase, remodify, then it's a different case. Even in that, you are still going to get a lot of boilerplate, so you would still require the human judgment. Otherwise, it comes across as very dry, I guess. We have seen cases where, let's say, if I personally modify the prompt, and which I feel I'm really good at ChatGPT, okay, but even then you can spot that it misses the intelligence. It feels like it's a blender. I think some people use the term that it's trying to combine a lot of things, but it's not natural, is what it is.
Yeah. So you capture the core essence of using generative AI to code, which is human plus human to create the prompt, but then humans must engage with the
Yeah.
code on the other side to make it better. And you talk about dry writing. I think the real equivalent, the analogy in the software world is it lacks context. It lacks
Yes.
nuance.
Yes.
It is not specific to the situation.
Yeah.
And so no matter how good your prompting is, you still need to deeply review the code as a result. And you need to deeply review it to make sure that it has the specific context for your situation. So there's a correctness issue from Gen AI code that is
Yeah.
solved by humans being in the loop. There's a security issue that is solved by humans being in the loop.
Yeah.
So, we all know about hallucinations, where Gen
Yeah.
AI will say something that's not true. Gen AI hallucinates when it's making code suggestions.
Yep.
And an implication of that is the code could have security risk, could be totally wrong. And so it all comes down to not just using generative AI, but then blending it,
Yeah.
which is to say, don't just use it pure, but making sure that humans first review it
Yeah.
and then make substantive improvements to it. And so, you answered in detail. I assume you would be very disappointed if a student came to you with an essay and
Yeah.
didn't write it right and just did the prompting. It would be very risky. It would be a really bad idea. Same
Yeah.
is true for Gen AI code. If it was just coming from the human, if it's just coming from the prompts, you would not. You would have a great deal of risk associated,
Yeah.
and you'd really send it back to an engineer and saying, please understand it, please modify it correctly.
Okay, amazing. And time flies when I'm talking to you, man. You are super intelligent, super informed. So, great show overall. I don't know if you're going to have any sort of closing advice for our listeners, as well as, how they can find you if they want to get in touch with you for more questions.
For sure. I do want to repeat one more time because I spoke imprecisely. Everything said today is absolutely the perspective of CIMA and not any other organization. Again, I apologize for misspeaking earlier in this call. This is only about CIMA's perspective and absolutely no one else's. And I really can't stress that enough. I think the key lessons, one, do not build your own software. Do not build it. It is exceptionally unlikely that you're going to be able to do it relative to experts who are building that. That's number one. Number two, if you're thinking about using open source software rather than commercial off-the-shelf software as a full solution, make sure you have an appropriate mapping of the true costs and the true investment. And don't think of it open source software as free. Think of it as you're going to be making an investment and should make an investment. If it's not, you should make an investment for sure. And then finally, if you haven't, if you're a medium or large size organization and you're not thinking about supply chain risk of software, it's not too late. Today is a great day to get started. Understand what if you're building software, what your supply chain looks like, and that is open source risk, and it is also an open source composition. It's also Gen AI code composition. And if you're purchasing software, start asking questions about its open source composition and its Gen AI code composition. Finally, to find me, happy to talk to any of your listeners. You can find me at MVI, Matt Van Italy, at cimasoftware.com. You can also find me one way or the other at AI at cimasoftware.com, or feel free to go to our website, semasoftware.com, and any of the buttons to learn more will eventually find me.
Okay,
Sam, thank you so much. Absolutely delightful to talk with you, and I wish all of your listeners the best, and thank you for a really engaging conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I think we are going to bring you on in the future as well. Again, super seasoned. Seema is lucky to have you as the executive. Loved your commentary, loved your sophisticatedness. Again, I don't know if that is a word, but super, super exciting. Okay, thank you so much once again for coming on. And for listeners, if you joined for the first time, this was part of our podcast series in which we invite exciting guests who are working on very exciting stuff in the industry. So make sure you guys tune in next week as well. We are going to have many, many, many guests in the future. On that note, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.